I'd like to introduce our next speaker is Dr. Catherine Edwards. Dr. Edwards is from the University of Georgia's Skidaway Institute of Oceanography, and she's also a member of the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, or SECOORA. And Catherine, I'm going to bring up your presentation here, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging our collaborators in this, both the co-PIs and the SECOORA Glider Observatory, Chad Lemke at USF, Harvey Syme at UNC, and Deborah Hernandez, the SECOORA Executive Director, as well as Maria Aristizabal, from Rutgers, who has been really helpful in some of the analysis and model comparisons. So with that, we'll get into some of our results in the South Atlantic Bight from gliders deployed during Hurricane Florence. Next, please. As several others have mentioned, in these experiments that we've been running through these programs, these essential ocean features that affect Atlantic hurricane intensity are regionally specific, and they vary from region to region. Next, please. And so in our region in the South Atlantic Bight, bounded by Cape Canaveral to Cape Hatteras, the Gulf Stream is the essential ocean feature. It dominates a lot of the variability certainly on the outer shelf and slope and beyond, but also exerts a lot of influence all the way to the coast. Next slide, please. So in setting up our regional glider observatory, that's been our focus, is using our glider surveys to basically map out the shelf and the slope from Florida up through North Carolina with shelf mapping missions and then shelf edge mapping missions, typically 3 to 5 deployments a year. But we've added a couple different hurricane glider deployments, additional hurricane glider deployments with IFAA funding this and past hurricane seasons. So next, please. We learned a lot of the power of some of these observations in the South Atlantic Bight through Hurricane Florence, which made landfall on the North Carolina coast. It approached the coast as a Category 4 hurricane with a peak intensity of 130 knots on September 11th. It weakened from that peak by about 50 knots before landfall, and with the minimum pressure rising about 25 millibars in the 2 days before it made landfall. After the storm bands began hitting, the storm stalled, with about half of the storm hanging off onto the shelf and onto the ocean, causing significant rainfall and flooding, inland flooding that caused significant damage. Next, please. We had the opportunity to put out 2 gliders in advance of the storm in the days before the storm arrived. Here's a satellite image showing Hurricane Florence and the track it took and its stage as a hurricane through landfall and tropical depression status. Next, please. We had 1 glider we deployed off of North Carolina, off of the Outer Banks, about 4 days before Florence's peak, through an NSF-funded project called Peach, studying shelf deep ocean exchange off of Cape Hatteras. Next, please. And 3 days later, we deployed a 2nd glider off of the South Carolina-Georgia border through SECOORA. In addition, we had, right as the storm was approaching, we had just taken 1 glider out of the water. Next, please. Bass was deployed by USF off of Florida, and it made its way up to North Carolina, crossing the path of the storm about 6 days before it arrived. So we have 3 sets of relevant glider data sets to work with. Next, please. First, want to show that we are sampling the Gulf Stream edge, both from the north and from the south. Here is a superposition of the gliders of Ramses's, the northern gliders, position over the 4 halfway decent satellite images available during its deployment that show we're able to nicely snake the edge of the Gulf Stream front, which really defines our coast, and it's the area that's most important for data assimilation in terms of getting the fronts right for these forecasts. So we'll next move to some data model comparisons from September 11th, when the storm was at its peak. These are comparisons of temperature profiles marked in green that show the profiles taken from the glider over the 24-hour period on September 11th. The black is a representation of that average over depth. You see the water column is strongly stratified with about a 15°C difference surface to bottom. The models underrepresent this difference. The blue represents the GOFS 3.1 model temperature, which, as was explained before, is the model that basically is used to initialize the NOAA forecasts. Next, please. Profiles of temperature, of salinity show a similar, show a similar trend that both thermal and salinity stratification are underrepresented by the models. And one thing that we can point out is that overall the tendency for some of the models is to overpredict salinity overall. But this is a nice fuzzy feeling that GOFS 3.1 is able to take the glider data in real time and incorporate it, represent vertical stratification in the models in the South Atlantic Bight. Next, please. The glider off of the South Carolina coast, shown here with its path in black, tells a slightly different story. Next, please. Again, we'll be looking at the same type of plots with the left-hand panel showing temperature profiles. In this case, though, whereas to the north of the storm, the water was stratified and the stratification was massively underpredicted, in this case, the stratification is overpredicted. And here in the South Atlantic Bight on the shelf is where you end up with the largest salinity errors that we saw in our model data comparisons in the South Atlantic Bight. We see a salinity difference of about 2 units on the shelf there. We have in this and other experiments had the experience that climatology is much saltier and often a little cooler than what we observe in real life, particularly on their shelf. And as part of externally funded efforts, we are trying to update that climatology, at least for our purposes here. Next, please. So now we'll get into some of the spatial variability. This is the track that the northern glider took over its deployment, moving generally from north to south with a little bit of a jog off of Cape Hatteras. Next, please. The comparison of the long track temperature, upper panel shows the glider measured temperature, and then the next two show GOFS 3.1 and 3.0. And here is just a really great representation of that GOFS 3.1 is able to capture the representation of vertical stratification in the glider observations. You see later on in the deployment when the glider is moving back and forth along the Gulf Stream edge and towards the Hatteras front, that the glider is resolving very high vertical aren't represented in the models, but including the little blip at the front on September 20th or so. And I'll just point out here, the scale of all of this is challenging for any scheme. Next, please. And then the last glider, the one that we recovered just in time to have sit in Wilmington with collaborators at UNC Wilmington in their coast facilities. We have the Gulf Stream Edge deployment. Next, please. And this is a similar three-panel comparison of the Gulf Stream Edge temperature measured by BASS compared to the Gulf's 3.1 and 3.0. And here you can see the vertical structure is generally represented. Stratification is under-predicted overall. And our next step with this is to look at more of the spatial representation of the front by looking at the Gulf's 3.1 solutions in a three-dimensional field. Because the sea surface temperature is at or above 30 over most of the South Atlantic Bight in summertime. I have a feeling that both surface and bottom temperature and salinity comparisons will be useful for determining when and where the fronts are. Next, please. So I'll summarize here and kind of give some additional food for thought. The gray lines here show the combined 3 deployments we had for Hurricane Florence, which gives a pretty nice picture of coverage of the Gulf Stream Edge and some resolution of our essential ocean feature in the Gulf Stream, which may have a potentially large spatial impact. In addition, we have some suggestion that shelf observations may be important as well. Next slide. Our strategy has been to go for the gradients, but I think we have to also recognize that these models and their vertical and horizontal resolutions, particularly over large changes in bathymetry with large gradients of pretty much everything, it's a challenge that will need some regional and smaller scale modeling to properly resolve some of these gradients. Next, like some of these temperature measurements showing interleaving on the scale of 4 or 5 vertical layers of temperature in just 25 to 30 meters of water. So what does a data assimilation scheme do with that? And so next, please. In our observatory, we've sort of balanced the picket line approach by our version of a picket line is sending gliders off of Florida as often as we can afford to do that. They typically take between about a month or so to get to South Carolina or North Carolina. You can go as fast as you want in the Gulf Stream, just about. But we balance that with a rapid response scenario, saving back gliders to try to put into storms as possible. Next. And then lastly, this storm in particular, because of the Peach experiment going on and the hurricane hitting just nearby to the Peach experiment, it's a massive opportunity for validation studies. This image shows the array of instrumentation we had deployed and a rough look at the 6-kilometer HF radar product. We have HF radars that resolved for this experiment down to 1.5 kilometer resolution, in addition to both idealized and realistic modeling products. So we're really excited about digging more into the data set and validating some of our thoughts here. Next. And then I think that's it. Just want to acknowledge our funding, which has come through NOAA IUs, through SECOORA, NOAA OAR, and then through partnerships and funded work through NSF. Thanks so much.